September 1944, Luxembourg, near the German border. The front line between American and German forces. German artillery spotters observed American positions through binoculars from their defensive positions across the valley. What they saw concerned them. A large American armored formation was moving into position. Hundreds of vehicles, dozens of tanks, clear signs of a major offensive being prepared. The spotters reported their observations to German intelligence. Aerial reconnaissance was ordered. Luftwaffe planes photographed the American positions, confirming what the spotters reported. Tanks, artillery, a significant American force. German commanders studied the intelligence and made strategic decisions. They repositioned defensive forces. They moved reserves to counter the expected American attack. They prepared for major combat operations. The American attack never materialized. Days passed, then weeks. The large armored formation just sat there, not attacking, not moving, just occupying positions. German commanders were confused. Why would Americans mass such a large force and not use it? Was it a feint, a deception? Were they preparing for something even larger? They never figured it out, because that armored formation didn't exist. Every tank the Germans observed was an inflatable rubber balloon. Every artillery piece was painted canvas on a wooden frame. Every supply truck was a hollow prop. The entire formation was a theatrical production created by American soldiers who had been artists, designers, and theater technicians before the war. At night, when German spotters couldn't observe through binoculars, these soldiers deflated the rubber tanks, collapsed the canvas artillery, and drove their props away in actual trucks. They moved to the next location, set up another fake army, performed another show for German observers. The soldiers performing this theatrical magic were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army. 1,100 men recruited specifically because they could draw, design, act, and create illusions. They fought World War II with creativity, not violence, and they were extraordinarily effective at it. This is the story of the most unusual military unit in American history, the story that remained classified for 50 years because nobody would have believed it anyway. Early 1944, Allied planners were preparing for D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. They understood that successful invasion required not just overwhelming force, but also strategic deception. Germany had millions of soldiers defending occupied Europe. If Germans knew exactly where and when Allies would attack, they could concentrate forces and slaughter Allied troops on the beaches. Success required keeping Germans uncertain, confused, spread thin across hundreds of miles of coastline. Operation Fortitude was the grand deception plan. It included Agent Garbo's fictional spy network, dummy equipment visible to German reconnaissance, false radio traffic, and coordinated lies from multiple sources, all supporting the same fictional narrative. But strategic deception at that scale required more than just lies and dummy equipment. It required theatrical production on a massive scale. It required creating believable illusions that would fool professional intelligence analysts studying photographs and intercepted communications. Allied intelligence officers proposed creating a specialized military unit dedicated entirely to tactical deception, a unit that would create fake armies, stage elaborate performances, and use every theatrical trick to convince Germans that American forces were operating in places where nobody actually existed. The proposal was approved. The unit would be designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Its mission would be classified at the highest levels, and its recruitment would focus on finding soldiers with unusual skills. Artists, designers, actors, sound engineers, anyone who understood how to create convincing illusions. The American military had never created anything like this before. They were about to recruit an army of artists. Spring 1944. Recruitment officers visited art schools, design firms, theater companies, and advertising agencies across America. They were looking for young men with creative skills who could be drafted into military service and trained for a special classified mission. The pitch was vague but intriguing. The Army needed artists and designers for important war work. The assignment would be unusual, dangerous, but different from regular combat. Creative skills would be more valuable than combat training. Many young artists were eager to serve, but worried that military service would waste their creative abilities. The typical military had no use for painters, sculptors, or theatre designers. Most creative people drafted into service ended up in regular infantry units where their artistic training was completely irrelevant. This recruitment was different. The military specifically wanted artists because they were artists. Their creativity would be their weapon. Hundreds of young men enlisted or were drafted and assigned to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. They came from prestigious art schools like Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, and the Art Students League. Some were commercial artists working for advertising agencies. Others were theatre set designers, sound engineers, or special effects technicians. The roster of the Ghost Army would eventually include several men who became famous artists after the war. Fashion designer Bill Blass, painter Ellsworth Kelly, photographer Art Kane, and many others who went on to distinguished careers in art, design, and entertainment. But in 1944, they were just young soldiers with unusual skills, about to be trained for the strangest military mission imaginable. Camp Forest, Tennessee. Summer 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops assembled for training. The men were organized into 4 specialized companies, each focusing on different aspects of deception. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers would create visual deception. They would design and deploy dummy tanks, artillery, vehicles, and equipment. They were artists and sculptors who would build fake armies from rubber, canvas, and wood. The 3132nd Signal Service Company would create sonic deception. They were sound engineers who would record and broadcast sounds of tanks, trucks, and military operations, convincing German listening posts that large American forces were operating nearby. The Signal Company Special would create radio deception. They were radio operators who would broadcast fake military communications imitating the radio patterns of actual divisions, convincing German signals intelligence that entire American units were present. The 406th Combat Engineers provided security and support. They were actual combat troops who would protect the deception specialists if German forces attacked. Training focused on speed and realism. The men learned to deploy inflatable tanks in minutes. 4 soldiers could carry a deflated rubber tank weighing 85 pounds, inflate it with compressed air pumps, and have a realistic-looking 30-ton Sherman tank ready for German observation in under 15 minutes. They practiced painting camouflage patterns on rubber and canvas that looked authentic from aerial reconnaissance. They studied actual tank formations to understand how real armor units deployed. They learned the maintenance patterns, movement speeds, and tactical behaviors of real divisions so their fake units would behave realistically. The Sonic Deception Company recorded actual sounds from real armored divisions. Tank engines starting, tracks clanking on pavement, truck convoys moving, artillery being positioned. They recorded everything, then engineered the recordings into elaborate soundscapes that could be broadcast through massive speakers mounted on trucks. The radio deception specialists studied actual division radio patterns. Every American division had distinctive communications patterns, certain frequencies, certain procedures, certain volumes of traffic. German signals intelligence monitored these patterns, using them to identify and locate American units. The Ghost Army had to replicate these patterns perfectly. By summer's end, the 23rd was ready. 1,100 men trained to create military illusions. An army of artists preparing to fight World War II with creativity. August 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops shipped to England, then to France shortly after D-Day. They arrived in Normandy in early September, just 3 months after the initial invasion. Allied forces had broken out from the beaches and were advancing across France. The liberation of Europe was underway. The Ghost Army's mission was to support real combat operations through tactical deception. They would create fake units threatening German positions, drawing enemy forces away from actual Allied attacks. They would stage elaborate performances, making Germans believe American armies were preparing offensives in locations where nothing was actually planned. Their work would be dangerous. They would operate close to front lines, often within range of German artillery. If Germans realized the units they were observing were fake, Ghost Army soldiers would be vulnerable to counterattacks. The men understood the risks, but they also understood the opportunity. They were about to use their artistic skills to save lives. Every German soldier fooled by their deceptions was a German soldier not shooting at actual American troops. The Ghost Army's first operation would begin within days of their arrival in France. They would impersonate an entire armored division, creating a fake military force so convincing that German intelligence would completely believe it existed. The show was about to begin. September 13th, 1944. Brittany, France. The Ghost Army's first major deception operation. The mission: impersonate the 2nd Armored Division, convincing Germans that a major American armored force was operating in Brittany when the real 2nd Armored was actually hundreds of miles away. The 23rd deployed to Brittany with their equipment, dozens of inflatable tanks, artillery, trucks, and support vehicles, all deflated and packed in actual trucks. They also brought sound trucks, radio equipment, and props for the visual deception. At night, when German observers couldn't see details, the men worked. They inflated hundreds of rubber tanks, arranged them in realistic formations, matching actual armored unit deployments. They set up canvas artillery pieces. They positioned dummy trucks and jeeps. 4-man teams carried deflated tanks to designated positions, used compressed air pumps to inflate them in minutes, adjusted them to create realistic shadows and angles, added finishing touches, tracks painted in mud, camouflage netting positioned naturally, maintenance equipment scattered nearby to suggest actual military activity. By dawn, a massive armored division occupied the area. German aerial reconnaissance photographed it. German spotters observed it through binoculars. The intelligence appeared solid. An American armored division was operating in Brittany. Meanwhile, radio operators broadcast fake communications imitating the 2nd Armored Division's distinctive patterns. They sent routine messages, supply requests, maintenance reports, all the normal traffic a real division would generate. German signals intelligence intercepted these communications, adding to the illusion. The Sonic Deception Company drove their sound trucks near German lines at night, positioned massive speakers toward German positions, broadcast recordings of tank movements, convoy traffic, maintenance operations. Germans' listening posts heard what sounded like major armored formations moving through the area. During daylight, Ghost Army soldiers wore 2nd Armored Division shoulder patches, painted 2nd Armored Unit markings on their actual vehicles. Some soldiers visited nearby French towns, acting as 2nd Armored troops on liberty, casually mentioning their unit to civilians they knew were reporting to German intelligence. The deception was multi-layered. Visual evidence from reconnaissance, radio intelligence from intercepted communications, audio evidence from listening posts, human intelligence from civilian informants. Every intelligence channel confirmed the same story. The 2nd Armored Division was in Brittany. German commanders believed it. They adjusted their defensive plans accordingly. They positioned forces to counter this armored threat. The real 2nd Armored Division, operating elsewhere, encountered weaker German defenses because forces had been redeployed to counter the fake division in Brittany. Operation Brittany was a complete success. The Ghost Army had proven their concept. Theatrical deception worked. Over the next 6 months, they would conduct 20 more operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. The Ghost Army's equipment was remarkable. Creative military technology designed by artists and engineers working together to create believable illusions. Inflatable tanks, made from rubberized canvas, painted with meticulous attention to detail. From 200 yards away, they looked exactly like real Sherman tanks. From 100 yards, trained observers could still be fooled. Only up close could anyone tell they were fake. Each inflatable tank weighed 85 pounds deflated. 4 men could carry one, inflate it in 15 minutes, deflate it, and pack it up in 5 minutes. A single truck could carry 10 to 15 deflated tanks, enough to create an entire tank company in one trip. The Ghost Army had hundreds of these inflatable tanks. They also had inflatable artillery, inflatable trucks, inflatable jeeps, and inflatable half-tracks. An entire fake armored division could be deployed by 100 men working for a few hours. Sound effects. The Sonic Deception Company's equipment was equally sophisticated. They had recorded libraries of every military sound imaginable. Tank engines, various models, various speeds, starting up, idling, shutting down, truck convoys moving at different speeds on different surfaces, artillery being positioned and fired, infantry movements, construction equipment, everything. These recordings were played through massive 500-pound speakers mounted on special trucks. The speakers could project sound up to 15 miles under ideal conditions. Played at night when sound traveled farther and German observation was limited to audio, these broadcasts created incredibly convincing illusions of large military formations moving through areas. Visual props. Beyond the inflatable equipment, Ghost Army artists created thousands of visual props. They painted fake signs indicating unit headquarters locations. They created fake traffic patterns showing where units were supposedly moving. They scattered fake supply dumps, maintenance areas, command posts. Artists paid attention to tiny details that made deceptions believable. They didn't just place fake tanks in fields, they added realistic mud on the tracks. They positioned camouflage netting that showed signs of wear. They scattered cigarette butts and trash near fake positions suggesting troops had been there. They created tire tracks showing vehicles moving in and out of areas. These details made the difference between obvious fakes and convincing illusions. September 20–24, 1944, Brest, France. The Ghost Army's second operation nearly ended in catastrophe. The mission was to impersonate the 2nd Armored Division again, this time near Brest, where German forces were besieged. The goal was to convince Germans that American armored reinforcements were arriving, pressuring them to surrender rather than fight to the last man. The operation began normally. The 23rd deployed their equipment, created their fake division, broadcast their radio traffic and sound effects. German reconnaissance confirmed a large American force was assembling. Then things went wrong. German artillery began shelling the Ghost Army's positions. The Germans weren't fooled, they were targeting what they believed was a real American armored division. Inflatable tanks exploded when hit by artillery fragments, deflating rapidly with loud hissing sounds. Canvas artillery pieces were shredded. Ghost Army soldiers dove for cover as shells landed around their fake positions. Several men were wounded. Equipment was destroyed. The operation was in danger of complete exposure. The 406th Combat Engineers, the Ghost Army's security company, returned fire with actual weapons, engaging German artillery positions. This created more confusion. Why would an armored division return artillery fire with only small arms? The Ghost Army had to improvise. They quickly deflated and packed up their surviving equipment, retreating from the shelled positions. They set up in a new location, hastily redeploying their deception. Fortunately, German intelligence never realized the unit they'd been shelling was fake. They assumed they'd successfully dispersed an American armored concentration before it could attack. The Ghost Army's deception technically succeeded, even though the operation was chaotic and dangerous. The lesson was clear. This work was real combat. The enemy was shooting at them with real weapons. The danger was genuine. Several Ghost Army soldiers would be wounded during operations over the next 6 months. 2 would be killed. This wasn't theater in a safe environment. This was theater performed under fire. December 1944, Belgium, near the German border. The Ghost Army's most successful operation. The mission, impersonate the 75th Infantry Division immediately after the real 75th Division moved south to fight in the Battle of the Bulge. Make Germans believe the 75th was still in position so they wouldn't attack the now weakly defended sector. This operation required perfect timing and execution. The real 75th Division would withdraw at night. The Ghost Army would move in immediately, creating a fake 75th Division before German intelligence could detect the real unit's departure. The operation began on schedule. As the real 75th Division units pulled out after dark, Ghost Army trucks moved in. Within hours, they deployed inflatable vehicles, set up fake command posts, established radio communications broadcasting in the 75th Division's patterns, and positioned sound trucks broadcasting audio of a division settling into defensive positions. By dawn, German observers saw what appeared to be the 75th Division still in position. Radio intercepts confirmed it. Sonic surveillance confirmed it. Everything checked out. The deception lasted 5 days. During that time, the Ghost Army maintained the performance perfectly. They even staged training exercises visible to German observation posts, having their few real vehicles drive around raising dust that suggested large-scale military movements. German intelligence never detected the switch. As far as they knew, the 75th Division remained in position throughout the period. They didn't realize an entire division had disappeared and been replaced by 100 artists with inflatable props. The real 75th Division, fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, benefited because Germans didn't realize how badly the American lines were stretched. If Germans had known the 75th was gone, they might have attacked the weakly defended sector and threatened Allied rear areas. Operation Elsenborn was the Ghost Army's masterpiece. Perfect execution, complete success, lives saved through pure theatrical creativity. Despite being a deception unit that rarely fired weapons in combat, the Ghost Army suffered casualties. The work was genuinely dangerous. They operated close to front lines, often within German artillery range. German forces sometimes attacked positions they believed were occupied by real American units, not realizing they were shelling inflatable props. At least 2 Ghost Army soldiers were killed during operations. Several dozen were wounded. Many more experienced close-call shells landing nearby, German patrols approaching positions, situations where they survived through luck rather than skill. The psychological stress was also significant. These men weren't trained combat soldiers. They were artists and designers who'd been given basic military training and sent to operate in combat zones. They experienced the same fears as frontline infantry artillery fire, potential German attacks, constant danger, but they couldn't fight back effectively. Their mission required maintaining deception, not engaging in combat. When Germans shelled their positions, they had to protect their fake equipment as if it were real, even while under fire. One Ghost Army veteran later described the experience: "We were play-acting in a theater where the audience was shooting real bullets at the stage." May 1945. Germany surrendered. World War II in Europe was over. The Ghost Army's operations ended. Over 11 months of active operations, from June 1944 to May 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops conducted more than 20 major deception operations across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. They impersonated entire divisions. They staged elaborate theatrical performances, convincing German intelligence that American forces were operating in locations where nobody existed. They drew German forces away from actual Allied operations, potentially saving thousands of American lives. Their success rate was extraordinary. German intelligence never definitively identified even one Ghost Army operation as a deception. Every fake unit they created, Germans believed was real. Every performance they staged, Germans accepted as genuine military activity. By any measure, the 23rd was one of the most effective military units in the European theater. Their unconventional tactics achieved conventional results, weakening enemy defenses, enabling successful Allied operations, contributing meaningfully to victory. But when the war ended, the Ghost Army disappeared. The unit was immediately classified at the highest levels of secrecy. All 100 soldiers were ordered to never discuss what they did during the war. Not with family, not with friends, not with anyone. The classification was justified by military necessity. Future deception operations would be impossible if enemies understood American deception capabilities and techniques. The men returned home to America. They resumed their careers as artists, designers, and creative professionals. They lived normal civilian lives. But they carried a secret they couldn't share for 50 years. The Ghost Army veterans found their imposed silence frustrating and isolating. When people asked what they did during the war, they could only give vague answers. "I was in a special unit. We did classified work. I can't really discuss it." These non-answers led to uncomfortable assumptions that they hadn't seen real combat, that they'd served in cushy rear echelon positions, that they hadn't contributed meaningfully to the war effort. Some Ghost Army veterans faced criticism from other veterans who'd served in regular combat units. Why couldn't they talk about their service? What were they hiding? Did they even see combat? The truth was, the Ghost Army had operated in combat zones, under enemy fire, conducting operations directly supporting frontline combat. They'd been as close to the front lines as many infantry units. They'd experienced the same dangers. Several had been wounded, some had been killed, but they couldn't defend themselves by explaining what they actually did. The classification prohibited it. Worse, they couldn't share the remarkable story of how they'd used creativity to fight a war. Artists by nature want to share their work, discuss their creative processes, explain how they solved problems. The Ghost Army veterans had participated in one of the most creative military operations in history, but they couldn't tell anyone about it. Family members knew something important had happened during the war, but could never learn what. Children grew up knowing their fathers had done something classified, but never knowing details. The Ghost Army became a family secret, passed down through vague hints and suggestive silences. Some veterans violated the classification privately, sharing limited details with spouses or close family, but swearing them to secrecy. Others maintained absolute silence, taking their secrets to their graves without ever fully explaining to anyone what they'd done during World War II. The classification would remain in effect for 5 decades. The Ghost Army would be one of the war's best-kept secrets until the final years of the 20th century. In the mid-1990s, Ghost Army veterans began lobbying for declassification. They were aging. Many had already died. Those still living wanted to share their story before it was too late. They argued that 50 years after the war, there was no remaining military necessity for secrecy. Modern deception techniques had evolved far beyond what the Ghost Army used. Revealing their operations wouldn't compromise national security. Military historians supported declassification. They recognized the Ghost Army's historical importance and wanted to document the unit's operations before all veterans died. In 1996, after years of requests, the US military finally declassified the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Documents, photographs, and after-action reports were released to the public. Ghost Army veterans could finally discuss their wartime service openly. The response was extraordinary. Media covered the story extensively. Historians recognized it as one of the war's most fascinating operations. The public was amazed that 100 artists had fought World War II with creativity and deception. Museums created exhibits featuring Ghost Army equipment and artwork. PBS produced a documentary. Books were published interviewing veterans and analyzing operations. The story that had been classified for 50 years became widely known within just a few years. What made the Ghost Army remarkable wasn't just their success, but how they achieved it, by applying artistic principles to military problems. The inflatable tanks weren't just functional props. They were sculptures designed by trained artists who understood form, shadow, perspective, and how objects appear under different lighting conditions. Artists painted camouflage patterns that would fool aerial reconnaissance photographers analyzing images with magnifying glasses. The sonic deceptions weren't just recordings played on speakers. They were elaborate audio productions engineered by sound designers who understood acoustics, reverb, distance effects, and how sounds behave in different environments. They created 3-dimensional soundscapes that convinced German listening posts of large military formations nearby. The radio deceptions required understanding patterns, rhythms, and behaviors. Radio operators studied how real divisions communicated, identified distinctive patterns, then replicated those patterns so precisely that German signals intelligence couldn't distinguish fake traffic from real. Everything the Ghost Army did combined artistic creativity with military necessity. They proved that creative thinking could be as valuable as firepower in warfare. Many Ghost Army veterans went on to distinguished creative careers after the war. Bill Blass became one of America's most successful fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly became a renowned abstract painter. Art Kane became a famous photographer. Dozens of others worked in advertising, design, theater, and entertainment. They brought their wartime experiences into their creative work. The skills they developed creating military deceptions, attention to detail, understanding of perspective and illusion, ability to create convincing narratives through visual design, served them well in civilian creative careers. In 2013, Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of America's highest civilian honors. The recognition came nearly 70 years after their wartime service, but it officially acknowledged their extraordinary contributions. The ceremony was attended by surviving Ghost Army veterans, now in their 80s and 90s. For men who'd spent 50 years unable to discuss their service, the public recognition was deeply meaningful. One veteran said, "For 50 years, I couldn't tell anyone what I did during the war. Now I'm being honored by Congress. It's surreal." The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond their specific operations. They demonstrated that creative thinking can solve military problems, that artists have valuable skills applicable to warfare, that deception and illusion can be as effective as bullets and bombs. Modern military deception operations owe a debt to Ghost Army innovations. The principles they developed: layered deception, using multiple sensory channels, attention to detail that makes illusions believable, understanding how intelligence analysts interpret evidence, remain relevant. In an era where information warfare and perception management are increasingly important, the Ghost Army's approach seems remarkably modern. They understood that wars are fought not just on battlefields, but in enemy commanders' minds. They understood that making enemies believe something false can be as valuable as destroying something real. The individual Ghost Army soldiers deserve recognition beyond their collective achievements. These weren't professional soldiers. They were artists, designers, and creative professionals who'd been drafted or enlisted to serve their country. They'd expected to spend the war in regular military roles unrelated to their creative skills. Instead, they got to fight World War II using their creativity. They applied artistic principles to military problems. They used design, theater, and illusion to save lives and defeat enemies. Many spoke later about how meaningful this was. One veteran said, "I was prepared to serve my country, doing whatever they asked, but getting to use my actual skills, my training as an artist, to contribute to winning the war that was special. That was unique." Another veteran reflected, "We weren't killing people, we were fooling them. We won our battles by being creative, not violent. That felt right for who we were." The Ghost Army proved that there are many ways to serve in war. That combat effectiveness doesn't require combat. That creativity can defeat enemies as surely as firepower. The Ghost Army's operations raise interesting ethical questions about deception in warfare. Was it ethical to deceive enemies so completely, to make them waste resources defending against threats that didn't exist? To manipulate their intelligence so thoroughly they made strategic decisions based on false information? From a military perspective, the answer is clearly yes. Deception is a legitimate military tactic. Making enemies misallocate forces weakens them without requiring violence. The Ghost Army's operations likely saved both Allied and German lives by ending combat sooner. From an artistic perspective, the ethics are more complex. The Ghost Army used creative skills for military purposes. They used art to facilitate war. Is that an appropriate use of creativity? Most Ghost Army veterans didn't struggle with these questions. They understood they were fighting against Nazi Germany, a genuinely evil regime. Using creative deception to defeat Nazis seemed not just ethical, but morally necessary. One veteran put it simply, "We used art to fight Hitler. I'm proud of that." The Ghost Army's greatest legacy may be demonstrating that creative thinking has value in unexpected contexts. Military organizations typically emphasize discipline, hierarchy, following orders, and conventional thinking. Creative people often struggle in military environments because military culture doesn't naturally accommodate artistic temperament. The Ghost Army succeeded by creating a space where creative thinking was not just accepted but required. The unit recruited artists specifically because they were artists. It valued creativity as a military asset. This was revolutionary for 1944. The military had never created anything like this before. The idea that artists could contribute meaningfully to combat operations was radical. The Ghost Army proved it worked. Creativity solved military problems. Artistic skills produced military results. Thinking differently achieved conventional objectives. This lesson extends beyond military contexts. The Ghost Army demonstrated that diverse skills and unconventional thinking can address serious problems. That creative approaches can succeed where conventional methods might fail. That there's value in trying unusual solutions to difficult challenges. Today, the Ghost Army is recognized as one of World War II's most remarkable military units. Their story appears in museums, documentaries, books, and educational materials. But for 50 years, they were forgotten, classified, unknown. 1,100 men who'd contributed meaningfully to Allied victory but couldn't share their accomplishments. This raises questions about how history is recorded and remembered. How many other remarkable stories remain classified? How many extraordinary accomplishments remain unknown because they're still secret? The Ghost Army's declassification allows us to appreciate their achievements, but it also reminds us that complete history is impossible while some stories remain classified. We should be grateful the Ghost Army story finally became public, that these creative warriors finally received recognition, that their remarkable achievements are now part of historical record. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, represents everything unusual and wonderful about human creativity applied to difficult problems. 1,100 artists and designers drafted into military service during the biggest war in history. Recruited specifically because they could draw and design and think creatively. Trained to use inflatable props, sound effects, and theatrical techniques to create military deceptions. They fought World War II with imagination instead of bullets. They defeated enemies by fooling them rather than killing them. They saved lives through creativity. They operated in combat zones under enemy fire. They experienced real danger. They suffered real casualties. But they contributed to victory through means that were entirely their own through art, design, theater, and creative thinking. For 50 years, they couldn't share their story. They carried their secret in silence, unable to explain what made their service special. Finally, in 1996, the classification ended. The Ghost Army could finally tell their story. The world could finally appreciate what they accomplished. Today, we remember the Ghost Army as proof that creativity matters, that artists can be warriors, that imagination can defeat enemies, that sometimes the best weapon is a good idea executed brilliantly. 1,100 artists fooled Hitler with rubber tanks and sound effects. They created fake armies that German intelligence believed completely. They conducted over 20 successful deception operations. They potentially saved thousands of lives. And they did it all with creativity, courage, and absolute commitment to using their artistic skills to win a war against evil. The Ghost Army. The creative warriors, the artists who proved that imagination can change history.